You may have been hearing about COP27 in the news recently. It is the 27th annual climate change conference hosted by the United Nations, and it starts November 6th, or if you're watching this video the day it came out, tomorrow. For nearly 3 decades, the UN has arranged global climate summits where almost every nation meets to make agreements and pledges to slow climate change. You may remember last year's conference in Glasgow, UK, or 2015's conference in Paris, France, which is widely known as the Paris Agreement. This year's summit will take place in Egypt. COP27 is not just another international summit. It is vitally important, as we are already feeling the effects of climate change. Just this year, major floods have ravaged Australia, Nigeria, and Pakistan, and huge droughts have dried up rivers across the United States, Europe, and China. Massive heat waves have sparked fires across the globe. The longer we take to stop fooling around and put all of our efforts into halting climate change, the worse things will get. Recent UN reports have said that we are close to irreversible climate breakdown. We need to act now. This conference being held in Egypt comes with a host of pros and cons. Firstly, one of the main goals of this conference is to solidify the partnerships in relation to climate action between developing and developed nations. Developing nations have contributed the least to climate change, but are the most affected by it because they have the fewest resources to deal with its impacts. A hope for this conference is to solidify the funding from wealthy nations to developing nations to help mitigate the effects of climate change and adapt to what's already happening. Hosting this conference in Egypt helps emphasize this need for environmental justice. Sadly, Egypt has problems of its own. The current regime there has silenced activists of all kinds throughout its reign and has censored environmental activists and climate scientists within the country in the lead up to this conference. There are a few other cons to consider about this conference. Firstly, there are corporate sponsors, which is never a good thing. This year, Coca-Cola, the world's largest plastic polluter, is a sponsor of the conference. Up until last year, fossil fuel companies could sponsor these talks. We cannot expect these conferences to work if they are being funded by the corporations that need to be regulated by these very conferences. Another problem with these summits is that corporations can send delegates to negotiate alongside the politicians, scientists, and activists. The largest delegation at last year's COP26 was the fossil fuel industry. They are the ones profiting off of furthering the impacts of climate change, so they shouldn't have a seat at the table, but they do. Another big problem with these conferences is that even when countries reach an agreement, they are just promises. Nations get to self-enforce their actions, meaning in many cases, they don't do what they agreed to. These conferences are vitally important, but they won't save the world. If the lawmakers attending these summits don't intend on keeping their promises and don't take climate change seriously, the conferences will fail. That's why there hasn't been overwhelming success so far. We need to elect environmentally conscious leaders and governments that will actually follow through on their promises if we want to halt this crisis. If you're in the United States, please vote for environmentally conscious candidates on November 8th. And if you're not in the US, please do so during your next election. Also, as always, all of my sources are linked in the description below. I recommend looking through them as there is a lot that didn't make it into this video.